in the space. It could be nice just to take a moment just to have a couple of seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, just silence, just to be and breathe. Taking a moment to reflect, to let go of the day, of everything that's taken for us to get here today. Taking a moment just to connect with the breath and our ideas, our vision, our wishes, those reasons for why we're here today. Maybe taking a moment just to envision our vision, what kind of world we're working towards, and stepping into that vision. Feeling it, feeling how it feels to be in it. And then bringing that with us. And then before we start, would anybody like to just to introduce themselves a little bit before Lily's talk, and what your interest is in and that kind of thing? Should I just give names? Should I just say, so like Christy, for example, you're next on my screen, if you're happy to say a few words.
That'd be typical, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think you're not me.
I hate go first, but that's fine. Okay. Yeah, so I've met you, haven't I? We did a walk up to Multi Uchath that time for a an autumn equinox ritual, didn't we? So I mean, I've been interested in trying to do something like an earth ship for quite a while now. We've got a local group in Ruthin who do incredible edibles and things like that, so I have sort of dabbled in that. But yeah, it's a weird time at the moment, so I guess for me, I'm kind of trying to suss out some information, because trying to find land, the right group of people, and the vision of what new world we can create really from this crappy situation is why I'm here, really. So that's me.
Yeah, I think I resonate with all of that. You know what she said? I'll go for that as well. Whatever Christy says, yeah.
Oh dear. I hope that's in a good way.
No, definitely in a good way. Yeah. So my name's Catherine, not Christy, but it's very similar. I'm not quite sure where I wish to live, what I'm going to do. I was very close to being part of a project. We almost bought land, but just different things happened, and we're still on the kind of the lookout really, as a loose group. But yeah, still keeping the options open. Steve, I'll introduce Steve. Steve works with Green Paw Project. He can't talk right now because he's driving, but he's looking to do a big project as well, and hopefully later he might be able to share some things with that. And next on my screen is Nala. Oh, can you tell me how you pronounce your name?
Neela.
Neela.
Yeah, I'm Neela. I'm based and I'm looking out for the last, I don't know, 18 months now, looking to join an eco village or start something from scratch or find the right people. So I've just been on the phone to someone potentially doing something around Lancaster. So I'm kind of all over the place as well. It could be Wales, it could be Spain, it could be Germany. So I'm kind of bit unsettled because I'm not sure if I want to stay on this island or want to go back to Europe. So there's a lot of questions I can't quite answer at the moment. And a lot of things I want to find out about, I can't really find out about at the moment because traveling is restricted. So there's all this, but I'm just interested, and I'm interested in this group and what's happening here, and hopefully I can share things as well. And it's just good to be connected with people who have similar ideas as well. Yeah, that's me, I think.
Yeah, I resonate with that as well. That's everybody now probably. And Stephen, you're next on my little screen if you want to say anything.
Yeah, you have to bear with me. I'm on a phone, and this is actually my first Zoom, so I don't know if you can hear me. So.
Yeah, we can.
Oh, you're first.
Yeah, I know, Zoom virgin. What can I tell you? So we've already got land. Our main interest is rewilding and conservation. I mean, we've clearly bitten off more than we can chew doing it by ourselves, and I'm sort of interested in the idea of if it's possible to tie it in with some form of community. Just what ideas, other people have different formats to the usual eco-village, just because planning just seems to be such a nightmare. And just, yeah, to get other people's experiences, other people's ideas, see if there's anybody who has similar wishes or expectations even to us, and see if there's anything possible to do with anybody.
Beautiful. Oh, thank you, Stephen. Oh, yeah, I hope to see that someday. Yeah, Stephen was also on some of these walks as well.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you and Christy have met or know each other.
Not really. I think I possibly remember you from Multi-Cuff, but
yeah, there was quite a few people, wasn't there? So apologies if I don't remember.
So it's a good sign that you're both here, I think. And Linda, would you like to say anything? Oh, you're muted is the only thing. Linda comes with a lot of experience as well, don't you?
Yeah, not with the muting though, sorry. Yeah, I'm not in Wales, I'm up in Norfolk. But I've known Catherine via the Eco Village Network UK since 2010, 2011, something like that. I first formed my own intentional Eco Village type community in 2008, but we've always had a land problem up here. I'm an architectural designer specialising in ecological architectural designs. I was promoted to group moderator at the Eco Village Network UK in 2011 by Tony Gosling, and I'm now working with Nick Rosen of Off-Grid Net and landbuddy.com. We're trying to reach out to landowners to get them to list the land so that people can move onto the land to look after the land ecologically in vans or tiny homes or whatever on a rental basis first, because it will be a lot quicker. So if anybody has got land and are looking for people to come on to help, I mean, there's the Eco Village Network, and then there's, you know, Diggers and Dreamers, isn't there, and many other platforms, and now that one as well, which might, I mean, there's over 115,000 members on Off-Grid Net. So there's a huge number of people who we know want to live sustainably, grow our own food and not have to worry with any of this faff or claiming universal credits whilst in lock-in. And we can all live in our own bubbles, in our own communities anyway, really. Yeah. That's that. And they can keep their universal credit because we wouldn't need it.
Wow.
You know.
Yeah, that would help the government out, wouldn't it? Really?
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Good vision there. Mark, would you like to share anything? Oh, you're still muted. Is the only thing. Did they mute everybody when you came in? I'm not sure.
Am I off mute now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, well, I kept pressing the button and nothing was happening. Yeah, I've only just joined this Facebook group actually, so I'm, you know, a bit of a newbie to this group. I'm a member of the UK Family Homesteads Facebook group as well. I don't know if any of you read the Ringing Cedars of Russia book series.
Yeah.
But that's sort of one of the reasons why a lot of people have joined that group. And they're interested in Southwest England and Wales. I actually live in Somerset at the moment, and I'm sort of fairly open-minded in terms of location. But yeah, I'm just sort of interested in being part of setting up an eco-village, you know, if the right land or the right property came up, really. I also work as a town planner, so I know that we have some challenging planning policies in this country to try and get around. And obviously in Wales, you know, One Planet Development, there is a bit more forward thinking perhaps in Wales than over here in England. So yeah, just looking to see what opportunities come up, and you know, whether I could be part of them, really.
Oh, I hope you get a chance to share a little bit about that. I'm sure lots of us got lots of questions to ask you about that. And those that got their cameras off, it is being recorded, so if you want to keep your cameras off, and just write in the chat rather than talk. So you're not shown, that's okay. But Tina, Colin, or Tal, does anybody, any of you want to say anything? Just giving you that chance before the talk starts. 10 seconds. Okay. You can always write in the chat later. I don't know. I'm guessing like cameras off, microphones off means they're doing something else at the same time. So I don't want to speak. So that's good. So yes, I'd like to introduce you to Lily. So as part of my research, I've been visiting lots of different projects in the UK, Europe, learning from them. And of course, not so easy to visit them all. And I just thought it'd be really nice for people to gain some of the experience that I gained, even when we can't even meet up and travel to these projects just yet. Or anyway, so yeah, Lily's one of the people that got me to go to Clock Jordan in Ireland, but she's got much more experience than that. So yeah, if you want to say a little bit more about yourself.
Hi, hello everybody. So I'm Lily de Sylva. I suppose I'll say before I start, thanks very much for having me. And if it's okay with everybody, rather than giving a talk, I'd love to talk a little bit about my experiences, but I'm happy to take questions and maybe have more of a conversation as we go along. So I've got the chat open, and if anybody wants to fire a question at me, and we'll start talking about that, just fire away. And if I miss anything, Katie's going to give me a poke. So I now live in the west of Ireland, but I originally grew up in a very lower working class family in South London, very straight, very urban, very poor. But for some reason, I always had a total obsession with rural living. I used to beg to watch all the farming programs, and I really fantasized about getting out of the city and living in the country. I don't know where that came from. That was just me. And my family thought I was insane, and I never thought I had any hope of doing anything in that line. And then in my teenage years, I started through school doing voluntary work, and I worked on adventure playgrounds in London for kids with disabilities. And surprise, surprise, everybody that worked on the playgrounds were hippies. And I just got introduced to this whole subculture where everything that I had dreamed of being able to do was actually going on in the real world. So got involved in all sorts of activism and organics and growing. And as far as alternative living was concerned, the main focus of that back in those days, and this would have been in the 1970s in London, was actually the squatting communities of South London. And a lot of those operated as intentional communities in an urban setting. So I was in Lambeth in South London, where there was a huge amount of disused council housing stock, mostly built in the 1930s. And we'd been through decades of kind of boom and bust and different governments and different regulations, huge demand for council housing, lots of people homeless or on the verge of homelessness, but a whole load of housing stock that was at a standard that was no longer deemed fit for human habitation, you know, that was no longer up to standard for the council to rent it out. But none of the local authorities had the money to do these places up. So for instance, where I ended up squatting some years later in Brixton, I'd say up to 25% of the council housing stock was empty at that point. And most of that would have been in 1930s tower blocks. Some of that would have been in local authority acquired, more conventional houses, you know, blocks of houses. Sorry, I'm giving you echo there. I'm echoing back somewhere. Are you all right? And I can't hear you either, Katie. Anyway, can you hear me okay? Yeah? That's grand. Once you can hear me, I'll keep going. So anyway, what had happened was then people had moved into that. Some of that was because people had ideas of alternative lifestyles and ideas of community living. an awful lot of that was motivated by the need for cheap housing. And because the government, you know, people were maybe a bit anarchistic, mostly very left-wing, recognized that, you know, they weren't going to get their needs satisfied by the local authority or any other aspect of government. So they took it into their own hands and dealt with it themselves. And there were big, thriving squatting communities. I worked on an adventure playground at the Oval in Kennington, and there was a whole kind of city block of old houses that was a complete intentional community, all squatted back then. And it became a huge movement, very, very organized. But it was interesting because everybody had their own different ways of organizing. Some people were very individualistic. Some people got together in blocks of houses or whatever and organized themselves. And I suppose the patterns I saw in the way that people chose to live then were very much reflected in the other communities that I've met later on. So, so I won't go too much into that because I might come back to it in different themes as we go along, you know. But through meeting those people, then I got exposed to places like Monkton Wild and other alternative communities and religious communities. And I got introduced to TP Valley, which is where I ended up going and joining an intentional community myself. I moved to TP Valley in 1984 and I stayed there for 4 years. Now I don't know if any of you that are here tonight have lived at Tally. I know the first group that I attended, there were quite a number of people there who had lived at Tally at one stage or another. That was interesting for a lot of different reasons, which again, I'll touch on later. When I arrived at Tally, it was actually just a couple of months before we had a huge public inquiry there where they tried to remove the community. If you're aware of that, there was the Secretary of State for Wales got in and there was a huge public inquiry, which was all based on planning and was nearly the end of the TP village. But we survived that. I moved back to the squatting communities in London then, and then took off with the Rainbow Circle camps and lived on the road convoy style for quite a long time, organising camps, and then came to Ireland in 1997 and have always been involved in kind of community work here and done a lot of work in kind of farming and the alternative food movement here. And through that, ended up where I met you, Katie, which was at the Clough-Jordan Eco Village, which again, for anybody who hasn't heard of the Clough-Jordan Eco Village, it's a major, major eco village project in the Midlands of Ireland, which I moved there in 2010. They'd actually acquired the land, I think almost 10 years before. And I had met people from that community when I ran the Cork branch of the World Social Forum back in the early 2000s. And they were trying to form that community then. It's been a really interesting model for eco-village living, but very, very different to what my traditional view of eco-village living would be, and maybe other people as well. But again, I kind of, I suppose really the main theme for me these days, and when I think of any kind of alternative living, is the first kind of theme I'd be interested in discussing with people, which is elitism in all kinds of sustainable living, but particularly in sort of alternative communities. Elitism and accessibility. For me personally, I've spent most of my life sort of dueling with homelessness, if you like. We had a very precarious housing situation when I was growing up. Because I was on a low income, because I ended up as a single mum, I've always been very on the edge of keeping a roof above my family's head. And although I was always fascinated by and very attracted to the idea of being able to live in these alternative ways, apart from those very radical things like the Peace Convoy or TP Valley back in the 1970s and 1980s, most of the things I've come across have really whether intentionally or not, been quite elitist. When I say that, I mean from the point of view of, I remember the first of your sessions that I attended, there was someone talking there about their basic costs of setting up and the cost of planning, and, you know, what was the bottom line for getting involved in the Eco Village project. And it was 40 grand, if I remember rightly. Correct me if I'm wrong. And while I know that that's not a huge amount of money in many people's books, for people at my end of the demographic, that's completely unattainable. The kind of people who rent accommodation all their lives, you know, are never going to be able to afford that. It's like for people who can't get on the housing ladder, you know, which is a shame, because a lot of people who have very alternative experiences and an awful lot to offer, it's just, you know, it's very hard to get to, but that's the lower end. My experience here in Ireland has been with much more organised projects. I would have had some dealings with the Hollies. Anyone familiar with the Hollies? No? So do you know Rob Hopkins of the transition movement? Okay, so Rob Hopkins was involved in a project in West Cork called Hollies Sustainable Living, and they bought land and they were building cob houses there. That project is still going now. And that's near Enniskerry down in Enniskillen down in West Cork. But again, it was all, it was a wonderful project, but it was very middle class and very, very expensive buy-in, very expensive builds. And then something that I found began to creep into all kinds of alternative projects here was that whole thing of value adding and trying to create incomes from things and trying to sell ideas, again, to people with money. And as Ireland moved into a very prosperous way of life, we suddenly, which Ireland was unaccustomed to, we crept into benefiting very much from our involvement in Europe and people becoming very prosperous, up to when we were in the Celtic Tiger in the late 90s, and there was this boom economy going on. So a lot of the green movement here was really involved in capitalizing on that, and that excluded swathes and swathes of people. So suddenly within that, you suddenly find that there's a subclass where you've got only a certain type of person who seems to be able to buy in and able to thrive within that alternative setup and alternative communities. But that was magnified much more then when I came to Cloughjordan. So has anyone here heard of Cloughjordan? Anybody outside of yourself, Katie? No, I can't hear. So there is an organisation in Ireland called Cultivate, who were going for a number of years, and they were involved in sustainability education. And there was also an organisation called FASTA, the Foundation for Sustainable Economies. So very academic bent, a lot of people coming out of the University of Maynooth who all got together with these wonderful ideas and decided that they would like to start an eco-village community, very much based on, a lot of them were involved in the transition towns movement. Again, a lot of them would have been sort of compatriots of Rob Hopkins, who again started off the transition towns movement here. I actually came across them because I was working with a rural development charity called Irish Rural Link. And Davy Phillip, who's one of the leading lights in Cloughjordan Eco Village, had developed a training program for rural communities called the Power Down Show. And so this was basically a series of about 10 documentary films with interviews and information, and then training sessions that came up with that. A load of us who were community development officers with Irish Rural Link trained up with that. And the idea was that we were going to go out to the people of Ireland and we were going to give Ireland sustainable living. that was very much the ethos, you know. And while that was in development, the Eco Village project was also in development. And initially, they were hoping to maybe get somewhere around Dublin. Most of them were Dublin based. And a lot of the idea of the transition movement and power down movement was based around urban living being more sustainable than rural living. And then the more they thought about it, they were like, actually, no, we'd be better with a greenfield site. They didn't want to, they looked at various sites around the country. They didn't want to be in a situation where they were living too far outside an existing community, where they'd be very much separated from whatever community they lived beside. They wanted to be somewhere where there was public transport, which is quite a challenge in Ireland. There's a real shortage of public transport in Ireland. And while they were looking, the community of Cloughjordan in the Midlands, almost in the very centre of the country, actually approached them and invited them to come and look at a huge greenfield site that they were selling within the community. And it was Cloughjordan House, which would be the big country house associated with the village of Cloughjordan, was selling off almost all of its land, what would have been its farmland, as a greenfield site with planning permission, OPP for development. And the land was actually immediately behind the main street. You've been there, Katie, so you know what I mean. There's a train from Dublin, takes 2 hours, and you're in Cloughjordan, which is absolute luxury in rural Ireland. And that's because Cloughjordan was originally a market town. It's in an area where there would have been Protestant and Methodist communities. So it would have been quite prosperous farming community. And a big high street going through a community of about 1,000 people, and a huge greenfield site that was immediately behind the main street of the village. And the way things are in Ireland, most of the economy here for some years has depended on tourism, and it's therefore centred around the coasts, mostly on the east coast, but also where I am now in the west coast on the Wild Atlantic Way. Most kind of development goes on there. Most business is concentrated there, and the Midlands has been very much ignored. So economically very depressed areas. So Cloughjordan decided they wanted to invite the Eco Village to develop there because they saw that as an opportunity to regenerate their rural community. So from the point of view of, I'm sure those of you that have been involved in various Eco Village type projects or sustainable projects in rural areas, you know, you may not necessarily have an immediate buy-in or acceptance from local people, which is something, you know, I'd like to talk about going forward as well. In Cloughjordan, ostensibly, the Eco Village community was welcomed in with open arms. But it was a very ambitious, it remains a very ambitious plan. So they went for planning permission. They basically, it's a 67-acre site. They divided it roughly into 3 sections. One section is for amenity and nature. Another section is for kind of food production, mostly, and other enterprises. And then the third, which was closest to the existing village, was concentrated on for building the dwellings. And they went for planning permission for 150, is it 150 or 155 dwellings? So very, very ambitious. And these were to be built to a very high standard. So from the point of view, like you were talking to me a while ago, Katie, about that thing of trying to form an eco-village and starting off with sort of rules and what have you. The charter, the eco charter that was set up for the eco-village was very, very detailed and very, very strict in terms of what people could build, what kind of materials they could use, and then around how they would be able to live in the project itself. So first of all, initially, when the project was first mooted, there was a lot of interest, amongst friends of the people who started it off. Again, these would have been people at that time during the boom. If you had a house anywhere in Dublin or the surrounding area, it was worth a huge amount of money. And if you were working in academia or in technical jobs or what have you, you were earning very well. So these were people with a lot of disposable income. So they were looking at being able to invest a huge amount of money into coming and building those houses. So the first maybe 30 or 40 sites sold quite quickly to people kind of within the social bubbles, if you like, of that group. And then things began to slow down. And I won't go in too much because I never joined the Eco Village. I was working for them and living beside them. But at the point where I moved to the Eco Village, I got a job helping them to set up a CSA farm that was a sister project that would be serving members of the Eco Village, but also open to the local community. And at that point, from the initial purchase of the land, they'd been in Cloughjordan for 9, almost 10 years, and they had just started building the first house when I moved there at Christmas of 2009. The first building was just taking place. They'd been bogged down in planning, which they were not expecting, and a whole load of other things that they weren't expecting cropped up. And while they were held back by the practical problems that they weren't expecting, we then had the financial crash of 2008. And a lot of the original investors were already beginning to drift away because they'd lost interest because it took so long for the project to get off the ground. And then suddenly everyone found that they were also struggling financially. The price of the sites, and it was necessary to keep the site prices high because of the cost of the infrastructure. There was was very high. And so basically sales for sites ground to a halt. A number of people who had already bought sites backed out. And then there were quite a number of people who had moved and rented places in Cloughjordan. They'd rented houses in Cloughjordan waiting to begin to build and had ended up renting for years and years, but were now looking at not being able to sell the properties that they had in Dublin and being caught in limbo where they actually couldn't start to build on their properties. So as a result of that, the whole thing in Cloughjordan has been a lot slower than planned. And I think it's probably exacerbated some of the other issues that might have come up around that, you know. So to date, as I say, there's 155 sites. And at the moment, I think there's 40 completed. It could be as many as 50 completed at this stage and lived in. There's another number of sites that are sold but still haven't been built on. And at the moment, nobody's selling anything. So very ambitious project. But yeah, from my point of view, it was really interesting watching the houses that have been built so far being built. Lots of really, really funky and amazing building going on, all kinds of materials that you never would have seen before, partly because of the scale of what was being spent on it. But in terms of cost, I mean, I never even considered being able to move in and become a part of the Eco Village. Way, way, way beyond my means. Yeah, there was a requirement as part of the planning to actually provide for some social housing within the Eco Village project, so that there would be some affordable housing to suit local people. Because bear in mind, we're talking about whacking up 150 odd houses in an area that quite a depressed area of the country. So part of the planning was a requirement for a percentage of the housing to be built by the eco-village for either sale as low-cost housing or renting out for social housing. But to date, the project hasn't been able to afford to fulfill that, unfortunately. But still, there we go. Very interesting to be alongside anyway. Any questions so far?
What kind of prices are you talking then that they were asking for? It was just for the sites, was it not? You know, when you have to build your own, what kind of prices?
Sites were going for, now you're asking me, I would have to go and have a check on the website now. We were talking about, gosh, I wonder if I can look it up without cutting you off. I don't think I can. We were talking very, very expensive. We were talking well over 100 grand for a site.
All right, yeah.
Now they were being sold as ready to go sites. The way they wanted to operate that was they set up a district heating system. So there was a large boiler shed that was heating water that was then supplying hot water and heating to all of the sites. There was also what was at the time when it was constructed, it was Ireland's largest bank of solar panels, which was supposed to be the initial heat source, the initial fuel source for the district heating system. And then there was a backup. So if there wasn't enough energy coming from the solar panels, then there was local wood chip being used with a big auger system feeding into the boiler. So that was all automated. It's all very, very high tech. Unfortunately, because we went into the financial crash, that was another casualty of that. I don't know if the solar panels have been commissioned to this day. I left Cloxjordan in the spring of 2016, and the solar panels still hadn't been commissioned at that point. Because unfortunately, again, it was one of these things where had they been able to go in and get going straight away, it would have been fine. It would have been grand. If they could have got going without the planning and legal hiccups when everybody still had the money, then they could have had things up and running much more successfully. Because they got bogged down in planning, and they did get bogged down seriously in planning. There were a lot of things that no one considered would be so difficult. This slowed things down. So a lot of things just never got done, or just were very, very late happening. And by the time they got started, we'd entered the financial crash. So things, I don't know if you know how bad things got here in Ireland. We kind of have only just really moved out of austerity, and we'll be going into another recession now with the year that we've had. But businesses hit the wall left, right and centre, including an awful lot of construction businesses, because a lot of our boom economy had been based on construction. So the company that put in the solar panels and were meant to be commissioning them went bust before they had completed the job. And because they had gone bankrupt and ceased to exist, that then meant that there was no financial comeback or no security for the eco-village. So they also lost a lot of money in that transaction, and were kind of stuck with a bit of a white elephant of the solar panels. It was one of those things that just nobody could have any control over. But fortunately, there was a source of local wood chip that was fairly sustainable. That was coming from just up the road. So that was running the district heating system. So all of the sites were sold ready to go with heating, connection to sewage, connection to internet. They got fibre, broadband and phone and everything going, which was, every site was served with that. So because the idea was that also they would be creating lots of jobs. So all of these houses, they were hoping a lot of people would be starting businesses and really regenerating the local area. And again, unfortunately, by the time people started building and moving in, the crash had come, and there just wasn't any potential for those businesses to take off. Not to say that people haven't. There are some people who moved to Cloughjordan and transferred existing businesses that they were able to set up and continue on from where they were. There's a guy who makes stainless steel fixings, believe it or not, and lives in a massive house with a stainless steel roof. And he just moved his business. Most of his business would be online anyway. And he just moved his business to Cloughjordan and carried on from where he left off. There's a bakery, a guy that had a very successful sourdough bakery in Dublin has set up and now has a wood-fired bakery in the eco-village. But there was also part of the plan was for a big enterprise centre, which was eventually built way behind schedule. And again, people within the eco-village have gone in and tried to do things within that big enterprise centre, and it's used a lot for events. But in terms of inspiring local businesses and getting businesses set up in there, none of those units have been rented out, unfortunately. And that's just partly, in all honesty, talking to people who were involved from the get-go, my perception would be that about 50% of the setbacks and unfortunate things that have held back the development of Cloughjordan were kind of curveballs from the universe that nobody could have done anything about. And the other 50%, you could say, was maybe a bit of a lack of foresight or a bit of overconfidence, or, do you know, the kind of things that we maybe stumble into when we have a big idea and a big dream, and we don't necessarily look at the potential setbacks to that. Or maybe, you know, I think when I've seen this a lot in like everything from helping people set up community health projects and community food projects and all sorts. It's very easy to be so passionate about your idea that you can't possibly believe that anything could go wrong. Do you know what I mean? It's like, yes, we've hit upon it and all we have to do is get going and this is going to be awesome. And that's fabulous. And I truly passionately believe in that energy, but with circumspection as well. And maybe going and getting a second opinion and just, is there anything that maybe we haven't thought of here, do you know, that might hold us back?
Yeah,
but there we go.
Yeah, the project's wonderful in so many ways, isn't it? The houses, it shows that you don't, you know, you can live ecologically and not be hard up, you know, you can live in luxury and eco. So it shows that.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, but unfortunately,
no, go on.
But unfortunately, it's just for those that can afford it still, because we're still in
It is. And I think one of the things that really attracted me to the project was, as I say, I initially met people who were involved in the initiation of that project many years before, back when we were having conferences protesting the Iraq invasion. Remember that? You know, that was a long time ago. And that was where I met John Jopling from Faster, who was a real mover and shaker in the setting up of the Eco Village, who has since passed away, which is another issue I might, you know, is the whole demographic of that when you're dependent on money or when things hold you back in life. But that's another. One of the things I loved about the project when John described it to me was the fact that it was quite conventional looking, because I suppose this takes us nicely on to my next issue, actually, because I suppose the next big thing, and something that was a big issue in Cloughjordan, but that I've seen in everything I've been involved in, is that thing of integrating. You know, if you're setting up a project, if you're setting up a community, how do you integrate with the people that are already there? Now, I've been involved in a lot of freaky way out things in my time, you know, as I say, from streets full of squatters to protest camps to all sorts of things, you know, and we've seen it at Tally, where people can see you as being so way out there that the barriers go up straight away. It can be quite difficult to get the message across to people of what you're doing. And to me, that more conventional edge, if you like, to Cloughjordan, and the fact that it's a clumsy way of saying it, but for want of a better way of saying it, it did not appear to be a hippie project, you know? They were going to build fairly conventional looking houses. They were planning to come in and set up fairly conventional looking and respectable kind of businesses. And the talk they had for how they were going to be, you know, looked like a great recipe for being much more acceptable to the local community, you know. Actually, part of my perception of that was naivety on my part, you know, and I think moving to Cloughjordan and seeing what actually happened was quite a wake-up call for me in that respect, I think. So again,
what was the wake-up call? What did it tell you? What was the
of all people, as I've said to you before, I come from very poor background, and I've successfully managed to remain very poor all my life, you know, I'm very working class. And so of all people, I should have seen it coming. But as I say, I'd experienced so many problems before with integration. You know, at Tally, we had a huge problem and people had to work so hard to integrate with the locals. And after the Battle of the Beanfield, the peace convoy, a lot of them turned up as refugees and arrived at Tally. And it kind of set us back 10 years in relationships with the locals, and everything had to be rebuilt again, you know. I thought, go in with a suit on, you know, and build a house that looks like a house. And sure, the locals are going to love them. And I completely didn't see what I, of all people, should have seen, which was the class divide. And so while on the one hand, there were people, you know, the people who had invited the eco-village development to come and look at the site in Cloughjordan were the people in the community who were on the local development committee, you know, the committee. And so they were local councillors, local business owners who would be involved in that local community development committee. And so they could see the potential. They liked the idea that maybe they were bringing kids who'd keep the schools open, maybe creating jobs. They could see all of that, but they would have been more middle class people within a wider community that was in a very depressed area of the country, where I'd say well over 50% of the existing community in Cloughjordan and the surrounding area were farming community or long-term unemployed in housing estates, people that had worked in local factories that had long since closed down. You know, I mean, Nina would be our nearest town when I lived in Cloughjordan, and that would be like a lot of rural towns in Ireland now. About 50% of the shops there would now be boarded up and probably will remain so for some time to come, you know. Very depressed area. So to have these very middle class people coming in, very well-off people, was not necessarily the flavour of the month for locals. And to have people building a very expensive housing development and talking about a lot of very expensive, very academic, very highfalutin ideas in an area where people had been out of work for 5-10 years was not necessarily the greatest thing in the world, do you know? And so the opinions in the local community were very divided. And while there was a lot of great integration going on, and there were people who were very welcoming, there was a lot of resentment as well. And the people who I feel got hit hardest by that were the children who came to the eco village. Now, I experienced that myself when I moved to work there as I say, I started the job January the 1st, 2010. So I still had my 3 youngest children at home with me. So I had 2 teenagers, a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. And then my youngest son was 7 at the time. And they had to then go and integrate into the local schools. And because now partly we're English and my kids have never picked up an Irish accent. They've always kept my very English accent. And partly because everyone knew that we were new in town and I was working for the Eco Village, everyone assumed that we were members of the Eco Village. And all of my kids went through a terrible time of being labelled the Ecos. Oh, they're the Ecos, they're the Ecos. And there was a lot of bad feeling, you know, and they got picked on a lot. My teenagers never really got over that. My daughter particularly. My youngest son, who was in the primary school, and I will say, like, I wouldn't fault, there are 2 primary schools in Cloughjordan. There's a Church of Ireland and a Catholic primary school in the village, and both of them are excellent. He went to the Catholic school just because it was the one where all the farming community went, and I was farming, do you know, so I said I would send him there to be a bit more in with the people that we were likely to be working with, where most of the Eco Villagers were in the Church of Ireland school. But yeah, again, there was still a lot of prejudice that way, and Russell's quite shy. It took him a long time to break that down. But he was, you know, my kids were not the only ones that went through that. And in fact, for kids that initially moved to the Eco Village, that was a huge problem. Now, I'd seen this before living at TP Valley, and over the years, there were a lot of different approaches to educating kids at Tally. And I think now it's probably the same as it has been for quite a few decades, where some people educate at home and some people send them into the local schools. When I was there in the 80s, the early 80s, most of the kids were not going to school. There were a handful that did attend the local school with varying success, but there was a lot of prejudice. And there was one child in particular, he was half American and his name was Dylan. And he had a sort of English American accent. And he used to get picked up. There was a local lady who used to run them into school. And by the time he got to school in Llandilo, his name was Dilwyn and he had a Welsh accent. And he had a change of clothes that he used to put on in the car before he went into school so that he could pretend he wasn't from Tally, do you know?
Yeah, there's just so many factors to think about, isn't there? There's just so many.
There are, but in terms, yeah. So for kids in Cloughjordan, that was tough. And the other thing that was tough was that there were actually very few children initially within the project itself. That's changed now. But one of the side effects of being a very expensive project was also that affected the demographic of people who were involved in it. So there was, I remember doing the figures at the time for a study, and compared to the demographic of Ireland as a whole, the Eco Village in Cloughjordan had something like 2.5 times the average number of people over retirement age. And that's in, you know, as everywhere, we've got an aging population, you know, and at the other end of the scale, that much less in terms of children. There were a couple of people who were initially involved in the project who moved there with teenagers. And for teenagers to move into that environment where there were no other kids on the project and they were seen as outsiders within the wider community, that was certainly, there was one family that just had to leave because of that. Fortunately, there have been families that have moved in since. There have been kids born in the Eco Village since. They've been there a long time, and that's changed now, do you know? But I suppose we're looking at 20 years down the road now that it's taken for that kind of level of integration to go on. Do you
Yeah,
know?
and do you think if there was like a magic wand and the houses had been affordable to like local community, do you think that might have changed that kind of relationship possibly?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it would have made a difference. But ultimately, I suppose, you know, if I could wave a magic wand and I had the means to set up some kind of project in an area like that, I would probably try and be a lot less ambitious, to be honest. I think the scale of the development really was the scale of the development was always going to be a setback too. Do you know? I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting. Yeah, certainly. If the houses had been more affordable, if things had been a little less ambitious, things could have moved on more quickly, and it could have changed the demographic of people taking part. Now, I do know, funnily enough, as I was preparing for this talk, I was looking back over some photographs taken in Cloughjordan during the time that I was there. And the group of people that were in the photographs, there are actually about 5 of those who've since passed away. So those are houses that are now empty within that eco-village project, only 10 years after it's been born, because people within the project have passed away and their families don't necessarily want to come and live there. Do you know? So that's a shame. Do you know? So yeah, it seemed like a wonderful idea. It was going to demonstrate to everybody how we could do sustainable living. And I suppose, you know, for me, ultimately, that was the big lesson of it as well, was just, it almost seemed like coming in to dictate. I think a lot of people in the local area as well felt, you know, they're coming and telling us how to live in the countryside. They're coming and telling us how to do this, that, or the other. And ultimately, unfortunately, you know, that's been set back quite a long way.
Oh. Thank you. Unfortunately, we've come about to the hour already. Like your amazing talk. Has anybody got any other questions at all?
Yeah, not a question as such, but I suppose for me, I'm getting the vibes that in general, I think people now are fed up with being in this system, and they would, rather than put labels on things such as eco or sustainable or this or that, I'm getting the feeling that it's more attractive to think of yourself as not having all the outgoings. So you've got your own energy, you've got your own food creation, you've got your own, so you're not paying out, because at the moment everyone's kind of stuck with being a slave to the system. So they've got to have a job to pay for the mortgage, to pay for the energy that they're using to the energy companies. And I wonder if that's something that's a bit more attractive to people. It certainly is. That's where my head is, really, more than it being, because I think once you go into something like that or a project like that, it automatically kind of will be sustainable and will be ecological in a way.
That's really interesting that you say that. That's really interesting that you say that, because something else that popped up there was, you know, and yeah, like for me, I would really agree with you, and that would be my dream. I would still, like, I'm looking at getting my own piece of land one of these days, and I might not live with other people, but still very much that self-sufficiency thing. And I used to teach people smallholding and all of that and producing food, and I teach people about producing food now. But the energy thing is really interesting, you know. And for instance, that district heating.
Yeah. Sorry, we've been looking at places that have got 3, so you've got a 3-pronged approach. So in my head, there's going to be a river, and I've seen it in Europe where they put like a turbine in a flowing river, and as that spins, it creates the energy, and then that gets stored, I guess, in a battery or something. But then you've got that, and if that's not flowing in the summer, then you've got wind. So you have your own small turbine, and then you've got so you've got kind of 3 or 4 different options to generating your own energy, and it's just about people being in control of their own lives, you know, and not having to keep paying out, you know, to the government or to your council tax or to your banks or mortgages, or it's all kind of like that, really. And I'm getting a huge sense that there's a lot of people thinking like that.
There really are. There really are. But I suppose there's a couple of things for me that come out of that. One of which is like the approach that you're talking about there is much more where I would see things going, where you have belt and braces approach, and instead of going for one big idea and throwing everything at it, you have 2 or 3 different things, as you say, the 3-pronged approach. And then if one thing's not producing what you need, you know, then okay, you're getting it from somewhere else, and doing a few things on a smaller scale to cover yourself and making it all more manageable. The other thing that came out of Cloghjordan was, one of the things that shocked me was the district heating system is a fabulous idea. And so you can supply, first of all, obviously in terms of energy, much more efficiently, supplying heat to all the houses from the one boiler. Also much more cheaply. What I found then was every time I went to visit anybody with one of the finished houses in the eco-village, I nearly had to strip naked when I went in there, because once they had access to sustainable and very cheap energy, they were keeping the houses at tropical heat. And to me, it's like, just because you have you know, I was shocked by that. I was shocked by that, because to me, I would always be, I've no heating on in my house now. As far as I'm concerned, this is warm enough. I don't need heating in this weather, do you know? And so the third thing that comes out of me for that, and I haven't just seen it in, like, Cloghjordan for me is a big example of something that really surprised me in every aspect of its approach. I'm still not sure what to make of it, but I've seen the same thing in lots of other ways. Like, I've worked in supplying organic food, and I often find myself questioning, what is sustainable? What is green? How can we put an eco label on this? Do you know, like, we have an organic growers association here, IOFGA, that certifies organic food, and they certify the imported food that comes into the supermarkets too. And you'll see an IOFGA label on imported potatoes during the season when potatoes are in season from Irish growers. And I'm like, well, okay, in my ethos, what's more organic? Is it this Israeli potato that's been grown organically and imported from Israel, or is it this non-organically grown potato that was grown 5 miles down the road? And all those labels become a grey area for me then, you know? I'm a lot less confident in my old age, if you like, now, about things like that, and what is green and what is sustainable. Do you know? And again, it's, you know, sustainable living is here. That was the tagline for the eco village in Cloghjordan. And actually it's like, well, if your teenagers can't bear to live there, or if people can't afford to move in there who actually need housing in the area, is that sustainable? Do you know?
I think that's too the old way of thinking as well, though, isn't it? I think we need a whole new way of thinking about things. I mean, I have heard of I don't know if anyone else has heard of the Ubuntu movement, and but even in terms of generating income, it would be something that, you know, I mean, now many people have been made redundant. I include myself in that, and I'm now trying to work out, well, you know, is it right to have a single business? Or, you know, a few of us are talking about, do we get like a cooperative in a way? So there's a few people coming together who have similar or complementary things that they might want to sell, but in a village like that, maybe it could be the food aspect, and you have a little mill, and you have, you know, use the river to make a mill, and, you know, you can go as far as you want with something like that, can't you? But again, it's just trying to rethink the whole thing, because I think people are fed up now of being told what they can and can't do, about having to have a certain income to pay for things that are outside of themselves. You know, they're not in control anymore. And maybe in terms of creating income as well and things like that, but also smarter building. You know, I've seen many buildings where if you have it in a smarter way, you have your main building, you use the outer bit, say, as almost like a conservatory style, but that's used to grow. It's like a little greenhouse, but it also means that your interior dwelling is warmer, because that creates like a barrier.
Exactly.
There's all sorts of different ways you can do it, isn't it? So
yeah, definitely. I mean, I know I've worked with a lot of people. I mean, here in Ireland, there's been a lot of alternative people have moved over here over the years. I left it too late. You know, I missed the boat because I moved over here in '97 and the Celtic Tiger had already started. But most of the you know, alternative types that came over here over the decades prior to that. One of the reasons they came, there's all sorts of things. The atmosphere, the social atmosphere is very different here, even now that things have moved on. But land was cheap. Land was incredibly cheap. So from the point of view of, I was originally going to move over here with an ex-partner of mine as part of a group of people who had a land fund together to buy land in Ireland, because you couldn't afford to do what we wanted to do in England. And so Ireland was the place to go. Unfortunately, the lads came and had a look at a few people who were already operating here and came back and went, fuck that, we're not doing that, it's really hard work. So I said, well, bugger you all, I'll go on my own then, you know, but missed the boat and came when the land prices had gone up. But yeah, that smaller approach, and loads of people who've self-built here without doing the big hoorah about sustainability, or just getting on and doing all of the things that you're suggesting.
Yeah, one day, Lily, I'll have to have, you and Frank will have to meet. You two would have a massive conversation about a lot.
Yeah, I really regret. I'm really sorry that we didn't get a chance to talk earlier on, because I would much rather have had that conversation. Than, you
and Frank have to link up sometime. You say, right?
Yeah, definitely. Now I can see there's a couple of messages here, and I don't know how to type on here without. Yeah, oh, there you go. So you've typed that. Someone was asking, what's the website address?
For the...
And I presume
for Cloughjordan.
For Cloughjordan Eco Village, yeah. You're much more technically clever than me, Katie. Could you?
I can find it. Has anybody got? While I find it, has anybody got any more questions? There's lots of great info on.
And you know what I'll do as well is I'll make a note of any questions here, and if there's anything like links and stuff, obviously I can't add stuff. Once this Zoom meeting closes, we can't put notes anymore, but I can put links to stuff down in the comments under the video when you put that up on YouTube. Yeah, that'd be good. If that's any help to anybody. Not a question, but redistrict heating, the rebound effect, like when you have energy saving lights, many people don't bother turning off the ones they don't need. Yes, absolutely. So the savings aren't as much as they might have been. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Beautiful. Oh yeah, I think Linda's another one as well. Well, probably everybody in this conversation actually. If we were meeting face by face, we'd probably after the meeting we'd be like talking for ages. We're going to do lots of conversation.
Well, okay. So I'll get a chance in before, because I know people have to go. I wasn't even looking at the clock because I'm a bad person.
Yeah. Any more questions before?
Just 2 points, really.
Okay.
2 points.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yes. Hello, hi, Frank. Hi.
Hi. 2 points. I did a paper in 1991 for the Centre for Technology magazine and it wasn't called the rebound effect, and it wasn't called the energy efficiency paradox. That's following a little tiny bit of history on that particular thing, called Jevons paradox and Kazum Brooks postulate. And Amy Loverns from Boulder, Colorado had also been talking about that thing in the 80s. In the 80s, 92. This was a year after I'd done this. It's like a breakthrough for me. Part of my learning. In 92, Open University asked Centre for Technology if they could use my little article, 2-page article. And in 1992, the guy that did a PhD in economics came out with all the I'm finding the right words here. He came out with all of the language to explain it all, and it came out as rebound effect and the energy efficiency paradox. So I was a little bit of a pioneer in that 20 years ago. The other thing is we went over to Ireland, Youghal, south of Ireland, to people we knew when we were searching for land in the 90s. This was after 92, 93, 94. We went over to Southern Ireland, to Youghal, and one of the things we noticed, I mean, I could tell you lots of things, but I mean, we would keep looking for the road. When were we going to find the road? We're on this side road. When were we going to find it? And we didn't. We went 140 miles on a side road because that was the roads in Southern Ireland. But we didn't find it. We didn't end up finding the land there. We ended up finding the land halfway between Pathelly and Flint.
But
Okay.
but one of the things we thought, two things. Yogo was the first place that potatoes came into the UK by Sir Francis Drake, and the chips were great. And so chips
Golden
were
wonders.
great, you know. And there was, just a sidetrack to the thing I want to get to is, well, the thing I want to get to is the people in Southern Ireland were noticeably sharing, which is our thing. Were noticeably, it's like you were saying about rebound effect, actually. We're noticeable when you're very close to nature, when you haven't got very much, more reliant on nature and more reliant on people, you tend to be sharing. It's in your genes. Yes, it's in your genes, and probably it's the same with indigenous people who are close to their indigenous roots.
Yeah,
sharing
but listen,
in their genes
that's
as well.
one of the things, Frank. That's one of the things that makes living in Ireland. I mean, you couldn't pay me. I've been here 25 years now, and you couldn't pay me any amount of money to move back to the UK. I'd never leave Ireland. And it's the people and it's the ethos here and the way of life that makes me feel that way.
Yeah,
it's largely like it's so not densely populated here. We still have less than 5 million people in the whole country, and we still have mostly rural communities. And the thing is that it is the same in the UK. When you live in still deeply ingrained rural farming communities, people live like that. When you live in very poor working class communities, you get that. Do you know? I know it's all a bit of a sort of Victorian BBC drama cliche, governor, and all of that, but actually it is like that. And I think, you know, that's one of the things where I'm sorry, because I know this sounds like Clogs Jordan bashing, and it's not, but it's just looking at some of the mistakes that were made. I know all of these Dublin academics went to this rural community of long standing where 3 different religious communities had survived side by side for centuries. And one of them was invited to say something at the pulpit at the Harvest Festival, and stood up and told them how they'd come to teach everybody how to do rural living and to teach them how to live in community. And that created a backlash of bad feeling in the community, you know, and you would hear people come telling us, because exactly as you're saying, people, you know, in rural communities actually already know that stuff. They already know that stuff. We should be going in, you know, if you're coming in as an outsider, you should be going in with humility and asking what they can tell you.
Finding out what you're going into.
That reminds me a little bit of what Frank was describing, what Ubuntu is, Christy, a little bit, you know, the sharing and stuff.
And I think it has to be something that you're really into, and it has to be genuine. You know, you can't go in. Too many people now are trying to tell everybody else what they should be doing, aren't they? But if you believe in something and people then think, do you know what, that's a brilliant idea, I want to get involved, then that's completely changes the atmosphere of it, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I think, you know, it's funny because, like, again, I've lived in such isolated situations here with the kids, and I taught my kids at home, and, you know, nowadays, like, if I had then what I have now, what we're able to do right here, right now, talking to each other online, it's just incredible. The access we have to information and to being able to communicate with each other is great. But unfortunately, we do have, I mean, I think a lot of the issues I've seen rise up in these clashes in communities over the decades now has all come down to people trying to tell each other, arguing over who's right. I'm right, you know, and you're wrong, and we have to do things my way because I'm right. And unfortunately, a side effect of the internet is that people now do this in spades and much more aggressively, because they're doing it from the safety of behind a keyboard where someone can't smack you around the ear, you know. And I think that's the biggest lesson that we need to learn is to just not be fundamentalists. Like, I think people, you know, go on.
But truth's good. So people are different. So they are going to have different tastes. They are going to have different views. And if you know that, then you can forgive. So it's like, whoa, you're not sort of like looking to everybody to be uniform, one way, you know. And we know how different people are. It's the bell curve.
Yeah.
eccentricity is not normal. So the bell curve tells you a lot. It's one of my groundings. Yin yang, opposites, not necessarily yin yang, but opposites, and the distribution curve.
Yeah, I just see that there's a thing from Tina here, and thank you very much, Tina, for saying that was interesting. You're very kind.
I really hold on to my anchors,
Yeah. Oh, you've frozen up there, Frank.
Conservatism, Labour, opposite, left, right. Sorry, but. Oh, all right. Oh God.
Oh, you're back now.
Did you not hear me?
You froze, but you're back now.
Has anybody got any questions or anything they want to comment?
Well, I can see Tina there has just said, so you love rural Ireland. How does it compare with rural Wales? And I would say, actually, in terms of the countryside and the climate and all sorts of aspects of life here, it's very similar in some ways, and the fact that it can be very rural. Funny enough, when I moved back here to the west of Clare just before Christmas, I took a trip on the bus into Ennis, which is the nearest, what we would call a big town here in the sticks. And it really reminded me of, I just had a flashback to Carmarthen. I was looking at the Whole Food shop, and it really reminded me of the Whole Food shop that was there in Carmarthen when I lived at Tally. I don't know if it's there anymore. And it's very similar, but I think my experience of living in Ireland is very different to my experience of living in Wales, because when I lived in Wales, I was part of the Teepee Valley, and that was it. And I was living as part of the subculture. And apart from going to town for my shopping once a week, I did not involve myself in the local community. Whereas in Ireland, although I have always known and associated with and got involved with what they're doing, people within the subculture, actually, I've lived within the local community. And the whole time that I've lived in Ireland, I've always been involved in the local tidy towns and the local Red Cross. I've set up first responder groups around the country. I've always been involved in the local community. So I've had a very different experience because of that. People don't think I'm a hippie here. They're surprised when they find out I'm a hippie, because they think I'm just an ordinary country person, but that's down to me. That's down to the different way that I've chosen to live here, I think, particularly in the last kind of 15 years since the kids got older. So that's the difference. Now, who's that? Oh yeah, Christy's saying to Frank. Yeah, no, Frank's got a lot of really interesting stuff to say there. Really interesting. And I would like to say, while we're still here, that I'm in the process of launching a website and podcast myself. It's been very slow in coming forwards because I've had a few setbacks in my own personal life in the last year. But I'm just about to start recording interviews, and Granny in a Van is my website name. I actually don't have a van at the moment, but I was living in my van for much of last year. And I was going to travel around interviewing people in my van before we all got locked down by COVID. So now I'm interviewing people over the computer. And a lot of what some of you have come up with today, I would love to continue conversations with you and maybe have some of you along on the podcast, because the whole thing of alternative lifestyles, all the stuff we've said about, alternative energy and the fact that you still need to conserve energy, what sustainability means, you're all full of experience and really interesting ideas about this. So if anyone's interested in having more of a chat with me, recorded or not recorded at some point, I would really, really love to hear from some of you again. Katie, or maybe I can, without showing you my nostrils, I could type in,
we're barely getting
now,
a taste of everybody here and all their experiences. It's just like
now I have a direct message here from Tina. I do not want to respond to Tina. I want to respond to everyone. That's how we do that. So I'm going to give you all my. I can't multitask. I can't type and talk at the same time. Isn't it appalling? That's my email address. And if anyone would like to continue a conversation on any of these, I would really, really love to hear from you, because you're a lovely bunch of people. Thank you for putting up with me for the last hour.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that talk. It's really helpful.
Thank you.
Really helpful. Brilliant. So I'm going to stop recording now, and then